Natalie Carter, a black state attorney, is wrongfully arrested when a biased officer assumes she is stealing her own car. Despite identifying herself, the officer ignores her, escalating the situation, leaving her to confront systemic injustice head-on. Where are you watching this video from? Let us know in the comments below. If you find this story captivating, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to follow more incredible and inspiring stories. We can't wait to hear from you. A patrol car eased its way into the nearly empty parking lot, its engine a low hum against the afternoon heat. Behind the wheel sat Officer Garrett, a middle-aged cop with a weathered face and a sharp, scrutinizing gaze. He was known for his hardline approach, the kind of officer who often let his instincts dictate his actions. Today, his instincts had latched onto a single, solitary figure, a woman leaning into the open door of a sleek black SUV. Natalie Carter was frantic. Beads of sweat rolled down her temple as she rummaged through the cluttered interior of her car. Papers, receipts, even a stray coffee cup, all shuffled beneath her hurried hands. Her purse wasn't where she had left it, and now she was late, very late, for an important meeting. "Come on, where are you?" Natalie muttered under her breath, her voice trembling with urgency. Her phone, vibrating insistently on the passenger seat, only added to the pressure. She didn't have the time to deal with yet another call from her office, not until she found her wallet. As Garrett's cruiser rolled to a stop, his eyes narrowed. He took in the scene before him, a black woman rifling through a high-end vehicle in an empty lot. Something about the sight didn't sit right with him, though he couldn't have said why. Maybe it was the apparent disorder of the car, the open door, or perhaps it was the woman's tense demeanor. Whatever the reason, Garrett's suspicion flared like a match struck in the dark. "Hey," he barked, stepping out of the car, his boots hitting the asphalt with deliberate force. Natalie froze. Her heart sank as she straightened up, her fingers still clutching the edge of the car seat. The officer's tone told her everything she needed to know. This wasn't going to be a pleasant interaction. Slowly, she turned to face him, her expression wary but calm. "Yes," she asked, her voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her. Garrett's gaze swept over her, his expression a mix of authority and skepticism. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded, his hand casually resting on his belt. Natalie drew in a breath, forcing herself to remain composed. "I'm looking for my purse," she explained evenly, gesturing toward the car. "I seem to have misplaced it." Garrett's eyes narrowed further, his suspicion deepening. "You got ID on you?" he asked. She blinked, caught off guard by the question. "I told you I lost my purse. That's why I'm searching the car," she replied, her tone measured. But Garrett wasn't interested in explanations. "Step away from the vehicle," he ordered. Her stomach tightened at his words. She bit back a retort, knowing instinctively that arguing would only escalate the situation. Slowly, she stepped back, raising her hands slightly to show she posed no threat. "This is my car," she repeated, her voice firm but calm. "If you'll just let me find my purse, I can prove it." Garrett didn't budge. His expression hardened as he took a step closer, his posture rigid. "Lady, you're acting real suspicious. You expect me to believe this is your car? Where's your proof?" Natalie's patience wore thin. "I've already told you. My ID is in my purse, and my purse is in the car," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "And for the record, I'm the state attorney." The officer's lips twisted into a smirk, his disbelief evident. "State attorney? That's a good one," he said with a chuckle. "You got any proof of that?" She bristled at his mocking tone. "If you just check the registration, you'll see everything's in order," she insisted. But Garrett wasn't listening. Instead, he reached for his handcuffs. "Hands where I can see them," he barked, stepping forward. Her eyes widened in disbelief. "Wait, what? You're arresting me? On what grounds?" "For suspicion of vehicle theft," he replied coldly, snapping the cuffs around her wrists. Anger surged through Natalie as the cold metal bit into her skin. "This is ridiculous," she protested, but her words fell on deaf ears. Garrett led her to the cruiser, ignoring her attempts to explain. As she sat in the back seat, staring at her car through the window, a mix of frustration and anger boiled within her. This wasn't just a mistake. It was a glaring example of the bias she had spent her career fighting against. The ride to the station was a blur. Garrett remained silent, his demeanor smug and self-assured. Natalie, on the other hand, was a whirlwind of emotions. She had been treated like a criminal, her words dismissed, her identity questioned, all because of a prejudiced assumption. When they arrived at the station, she was placed in a cold, dimly lit holding cell. The hard plastic chair she sat in was uncomfortable, and the tightness of the cuffs only added to her growing resentment. Across the room, Garrett filled out paperwork, his posture relaxed, as if this were just another routine day for him. "Hey," Natalie called out, her voice sharp. "Can I at least get these cuffs off?" Garrett glanced up briefly, his smirk returning. "You'll get your turn," he said dismissively, returning to his forms. She let out a slow breath, willing herself to stay calm. This wasn't the time to lose her temper. She needed to think clearly to figure out her next move. Closing her eyes, she replayed the events in her mind, searching for a way to resolve the situation without further escalating it. Finally, Garrett strolled over, his expression smug as ever. "Ready to come clean yet?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. Natalie met his gaze with icy resolve. "I've told you the truth from the start. I'm the state attorney, and you've made a huge mistake." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Sure you are. Let's see if that fancy title holds up when you don't have any proof." Before she could respond, another officer approached, a younger man with an uneasy expression. "Officer Garrett," he said hesitantly, "shouldn't we check the plates? Just to be sure." Garrett waved him off. "She'll get her phone call when I say she does," he replied, his tone dismissive. Natalie clenched her fists, the cuffs digging into her wrists. She knew she couldn't rely on Garrett to do the right thing, but she had to find a way to get someone else to listen. "Fine," Garrett said after what felt like an eternity. "You want your phone call? Go ahead." When she finally dialed the number she knew by heart, relief washed over her as a familiar voice answered. "Mark Edwards," came the sharp, professional tone. "Mark, it's Natalie," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I'm at the station. I've been arrested." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a sharp intake of breath. "Arrested? For what?" "They think I'm stealing my own car," she replied dryly. Mark's voice hardened. "Which station?" "Central Precinct." "I'm on my way." "Don't say anything else," he said firmly before hanging up. Natalie placed the receiver back down, turning to face Garrett. "My lawyer's coming," she said simply. Garrett raised an eyebrow, his smirk faltering slightly. "We'll see about that," he muttered. She sat back, her mind racing. Mark was one of the best attorneys she knew, and if anyone could untangle this mess, it was him. But even as she waited, the weight of the injustice settled heavily on her chest. This wasn't just about her. It was about every person who had ever been treated like this, who didn't have the resources or connections to fight back. When Mark finally arrived, his sharp gray suit and commanding presence filled the room. Garrett's smugness wavered as the younger attorney took control, his tone cutting and precise as he laid out the officer's mistakes. "You've arrested the state attorney without cause, violated her rights, and failed to perform even the most basic checks," Mark said coldly. Garrett faltered, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Mark's words. As the truth unraveled, the balance of power shifted, leaving Garrett exposed. But for Natalie, the battle was far from over. This wasn't just about clearing her name. It was about challenging a broken system and ensuring that no one else had to endure the same indignity. As she walked out of the station, her resolve hardened. This was just the beginning. The air in the precinct buzzed with tension as Natalie sat in the holding cell, her mind racing with a mix of frustration and determination. Mark's arrival had already sent ripples through the station. Officers exchanged uneasy glances, aware that this wasn't just another case of mistaken identity. Mark Edwards wasn't just any lawyer. He was a man with a reputation for dismantling unjust systems, one case at a time. Garrett, however, leaned against the wall with a cocky grin, seemingly unfazed. Mark didn't waste time. His voice cut through the stagnant air like a knife. "We're not waiting for someone to decide to do their job. Run the plates, check her registration, and verify her identity immediately." A younger officer, visibly uncomfortable, hesitated. Officer Garrett? Should we? Garrett waved a dismissive hand. There's no need. I've seen this play before. They all have a story. Mark stepped closer, his tone icy. This isn't a story. This is a state attorney you've unlawfully detained. If you're not going to do your job, I'll make sure someone higher up does. The younger officer shifted nervously, glancing at Garrett, who scowled but said nothing. Finally, he muttered, "Fine. Run the plates." The room felt like it had paused, the tension so thick it was nearly tangible. Natalie sat still, her jaw tight as she watched the officers. Garrett's confidence wavered for a fraction of a second before his usual bravado kicked in. "You think you can intimidate me with a title?" he sneered. "I've dealt with people like you before. You're not special." Mark didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to Natalie, his voice softer now. "They'll run the plates, and when they see the truth, we'll make sure this doesn't just go away. This isn't just about you. It's about everyone who's been treated like this." Natalie nodded, her gaze steady. "I know, and that's exactly why we can't let this slide." Meanwhile, in another corner of the station, Officer Garrett watched as his younger colleague reluctantly tapped away at a keyboard, pulling up the registration information. Garrett crossed his arms, his expression smug, as if daring the computer to prove him wrong. But when the screen blinked to life, his smirk vanished. The room seemed to grow colder as the younger officer turned, his face pale. The vehicle's registered to Natalie Carter, and it's confirmed she's the state attorney. For a moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening, the weight of the revelation crashing down on everyone in the room. Garrett's face hardened, his jaw tightening as he tried to maintain his composure. But the damage was done. Mark stepped forward, his voice ringing with authority. "Uncuff her. Now!" The younger officer hurried to comply, his hands fumbling as he unlocked the cuffs from Natalie's wrists. She stood, rubbing the raw marks on her skin, but keeping her expression calm, though her eyes burned with quiet fury. Garrett took a step forward, his voice defensive. "Look, this doesn't change the fact that she was acting suspicious. I made a judgment call." Natalie turned to face him, her voice steady but sharp. "A judgment call based on nothing but your own biases. You saw me, and you assumed I didn't belong. You ignored everything I said because you'd already decided who I was." Garrett's face flushed, but he didn't back down. "I was doing my job." Mark's voice cut in, low and dangerous. "No, you weren't. Your job is to investigate, to confirm, to ensure that you're upholding the law, not violating it. You didn't follow procedure, and now you're trying to justify it." The tension in the room was palpable as Garrett squared his shoulders, his pride refusing to let him back down completely. "I'll file a report," he muttered, as if that could erase what had happened. But Natalie wasn't done. She stepped closer, her voice firm. "You can file all the reports you want, but this isn't over. Not for me, and not for the countless others who don't have the privilege of calling someone like Mark. People who've been silenced, ignored, and treated like criminals without a chance to defend themselves. This ends now." As the words hung in the air, the station's door swung open, and a new figure entered. Chief Reynolds, a tall man with graying hair and an air of authority, stepped into the room, his expression unreadable. His gaze swept over the scene, taking in Natalie's freed wrists, Garrett's defensive stance, and Mark's unyielding glare. "What's going on here?" the chief asked, his voice calm but commanding. Mark turned to him, his tone measured but firm. "Your officer detained the state attorney without cause, refused to verify her identity, and ignored her repeated attempts to explain the situation." Chief Reynolds' eyes flicked to Garrett, his expression tightening slightly. "Is this true?" Garrett hesitated, the weight of the room pressing down on him. I made a call based on the circumstances," he said, his voice lacking its usual confidence. Reynolds' jaw tightened. "A call that led to unlawfully detaining one of the most prominent legal figures in this city." Garrett looked away, his fists clenching at his sides. But before he could respond, Natalie spoke up. "Chief, this isn't just about me. This is about a culture that allows officers like Garrett to act on their biases without accountability. This is about a system that protects people like him and leaves people like me fighting to prove we belong. Reynolds met her gaze, his expression unreadable for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. You're right, and this will be addressed. Mark's voice was sharp as he added, it needs to be more than addressed, Chief. It needs to be dismantled. Because if it's not, this will happen again, and next time, it might not end with someone walking out of here alive. Reynolds' expression darkened, the weight of the statement settling over him. He turned to Garrett, his tone firm. You're suspended pending an investigation. Hand over your badge and gun. Garrett's face turned red, his mouth opening as if to protest, but he stopped himself. Slowly, reluctantly, he unfastened his badge and placed it on the desk, followed by his gun. The room was silent as he turned and walked out, his shoulders tense with barely contained anger. As the door swung shut behind him, Chief Reynolds turned back to Natalie and Mark. This department owes you an apology, and I'll ensure you get one. But more than that, I'll make sure this is a turning point. Natalie nodded, her voice steady but filled with purpose. It has to be, because if it's not, this won't be the last time we're having this conversation. Mark placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder as the chief nodded, a solemn, understanding passing between them. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like the tide might be turning. As they left the station, Natalie glanced back, her resolve stronger than ever. This wasn't just her fight. It was a fight for everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, and forgotten. And she wasn't about to let it end here. As Natalie stepped out of the station into the cool evening air, the weight of the day hung heavily on her shoulders. The streetlights cast long shadows on the pavement, mirroring the lingering frustration in her heart. Mark walked beside her, silent for a moment, as if gauging how much to say. He finally spoke, his voice low but firm, cutting through the hum of distant traffic. They suspended him, but that's not enough, Mark said. This isn't just about one officer. It's the entire system, Natalie. She stopped walking and turned to face him, her eyes hard. I know that, but it's a start, and I'll make sure it doesn't stop here. Mark nodded, his expression unreadable. You're going to have a fight on your hands. People like Garrett don't go down quietly. Her lips tightened into a thin line. Let him try. I've been fighting my whole life to be taken seriously. This is just another battle. The determination in her voice was clear, but beneath it was something deeper, an exhaustion that Mark could hear but didn't address. Instead, he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. Let's take this step by step. We'll make sure they hear you. The next day, Natalie's name was splashed across the news. Local reporters had caught wind of the incident, and while the department had tried to keep the details under wraps, someone had leaked the story. The headlines ranged from sensational to accusatory, but they all had one thing in common. They put Officer Garrett and the precinct under a harsh spotlight. Natalie sat at her desk, scrolling through article after article. Some painted her as a victim, a hero standing against injustice. Others subtly questioned her account, insinuating that her position as state attorney might have been the only reason the situation hadn't escalated further. She clenched her jaw, the weight of public scrutiny pressing down on her. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was Chief Reynolds. She hesitated for a moment before answering. MS. Carter. His voice was formal, but there was a note of something else, regret perhaps. I wanted to let you know that the department is moving forward with the investigation. I've also scheduled a press conference for tomorrow to address the situation. Natalie's eyebrows lifted in surprise. A press conference? Yes. We need to get ahead of this. The department's reputation is on the line. Her tone sharpened. And what about my reputation, Chief? What about the people who don't have the platform I do? Are you planning to address that, or is this just about damage control? There was a pause on the other end before he replied, his voice quieter now. I want to do the right thing, Ms. Carter, but I need your help to navigate this. She let out a slow breath, her mind racing. I'll be there, but let's be clear, Chief. This isn't about protecting your department's image. This is about accountability. If you're not willing to commit to real change, I'll make sure the public knows that too. The silence on the other end was telling. Finally, Reynolds sighed. Understood. I'll see you tomorrow. The next morning, the press conference was packed. Reporters jostled for position, their cameras and microphones trained on the podium where Chief Reynolds stood, flanked by Natalie and Mark. Garrett was conspicuously absent, though his name lingered in every whispered conversation. Reynolds began, his tone measured and deliberate. Yesterday, an incident occurred involving one of our officers and State Attorney Natalie Carter. After reviewing the initial facts, it's clear that mistakes were made. On behalf of the department, I want to extend my deepest apologies to Ms. Carter. The room buzzed with murmurs, but Natalie's expression remained stoic. Reynolds continued, "We are launching a full investigation into the officer's conduct and reviewing our training protocols to ensure this doesn't happen again." As he spoke, Natalie's eyes scanned the crowd. She could feel their eyes on her, waiting for her to speak. When Reynolds stepped back, gesturing for her to take the podium, the room fell silent. She took a deep breath and stepped forward, her voice steady as she addressed the crowd. "What happened to me wasn't an isolated incident. It's part of a larger problem, a system that allows bias and prejudice to dictate how people are treated. I'm standing here today because I have a title and connections. But what about the people who don't? How many voices go unheard? How many lives are upended without anyone noticing?" Her words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. This isn't just about one officer. It's about all of us. It's about holding ourselves accountable and demanding better from the systems meant to protect us. And I won't stop until we see real change. The room erupted into a flurry of questions, reporters shouting over one another. But Natalie didn't linger. She stepped back, letting Mark guide her off the stage as the cameras continued to flash. In the following days, the pressure on the department mounted. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, holding signs that read "Justice for All" and "End Racial Profiling." Social media exploded with hashtags demanding accountability. Garrett, now a symbol of systemic failure, became the center of a storm he couldn't escape. Behind the scenes, Natalie worked tirelessly. She met with community leaders, gathered stories from others who had faced similar injustices, and pushed for policy changes within the department. But as the days turned into weeks, the fight took its toll. The late nights and constant scrutiny began to wear on her, though she refused to let it show. One evening, as she prepared for another community meeting, her phone buzzed. It was an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "Natalie Carter," she said, her voice brisk. There was a pause before a familiar voice spoke. "Ms. Carter, this is Officer Garrett." Her grip on the phone tightened. "What do you want?" she asked, her tone cold. "I need to talk to you." "Off the record," he said, his voice low and strained. "There's something you need to know." Her heart raced, suspicion flaring. "If this is some kind of—" "It's not," he interrupted, his tone urgent. "Just meet me, please." She hesitated, her mind racing with possibilities. Finally, she agreed, setting a time and place. But as she hung up, a knot of unease settled in her stomach. Something about this didn't feel right, but she knew she had to see it through. Whatever Garrett had to say, it could change everything. The meeting spot was a small, nondescript diner on the edge of town, its neon sign flickering faintly against the dark sky. Natalie arrived early, her eyes scanning the parking lot for anything out of place. Her unease had only grown since the call, but she had to know why Garrett, the man who had treated her with such disdain, suddenly wanted to talk. She stepped inside, the scent of coffee and fried food enveloping her as the door creaked shut behind her. Garrett was already there, seated in a corner booth, his posture slouched, but his eyes sharp. He looked different, less sure of himself, as though the weight of the past weeks had finally begun to crush his carefully constructed facade. She approached slowly, her guard up, and slid into the seat across from him. "You've got 5 minutes," Natalie said, her tone cool but steady. "Make it count." Garrett glanced around the diner, his eyes darting toward the lone waitress, wiping down a table before he leaned forward. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "You don't know the whole story." She crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. "Enlighten me." He hesitated, his fingers tapping nervously against the tabletop. "Look, I know I screwed up," he admitted, his voice strained. "But it's bigger than me. Bigger than you. Natalie's eyes narrowed, her skepticism growing. What are you talking about? Garrett sighed, rubbing the back of his neck as he tried to find the words. There's a system, a way things are done, and if you don't play along, you get pushed out. I didn't think twice about it before, but now, he stopped, his jaw tightening. Now I see how far it goes. Her heartbeat quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. Are you saying there's corruption in the department? He nodded, his gaze dropping to the table. It's not just corruption. It's bias, quotas, the whole thing. They don't want people like you to succeed. They don't even want people like me to speak out. That's why I called you. I'm in trouble. Her voice was sharp, cutting through his hesitation. Why should I believe you? You've done nothing but dismiss me, mock me, and undermine me. Now, suddenly, you want my help? He looked up, his eyes pleading. Because I'm telling the truth. You have no idea how deep this goes. If you keep pushing, they'll come after you too. Her breath caught for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. Let them try. I'm not afraid of exposing the truth. Garrett shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. You should be. You think they'll let you just walk in and tear it all down? They'll ruin you, Natalie. And if that doesn't work, they'll find other ways to silence you. The words hung heavy in the air, but Natalie refused to show any sign of fear. If you have proof, give it to me. Otherwise, this conversation is over. He hesitated again, his hand reaching into his pocket. For a brief second, she tensed, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. But when he pulled out a small USB drive and placed it on the table, she exhaled quietly. Everything I have is on here, Garrett said, his voice barely audible. Documents, emails, recordings. It's not much, but it's enough to get you started. She picked up the drive, her fingers tightening around it. Why now? Why come forward after everything? His expression hardened, a flicker of anger crossing his face. Because I didn't sign up for this. I didn't become a cop to ruin lives. And seeing how they're willing to throw me under the bus to protect themselves, I can't keep pretending it's all okay. Natalie studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. There was something different in his demeanor, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before. But whether it was genuine or born out of desperation, she couldn't be sure. This doesn't absolve you, she said finally, her voice firm. If what's on here is real, you'll still have to answer for your part in all of this. Garrett nodded, his shoulders slumping. I know. I'm not looking for a free pass. I need someone to do what I couldn't. She stood, slipping the drive in her pocket. We'll see. As she walked out of the diner, the weight of the USB drive felt heavier than it should. She knew that whatever was on it could change everything, but it could also make her a target. The stakes were higher now, and the path ahead was more dangerous than ever. But as she climbed in her car and started the engine, a sense of resolve settled over her. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had been silenced by the very system meant to protect them. Back at her apartment, Natalie sat at her desk, her laptop open and the USB drive resting in her hand. She hesitated for a moment, the gravity of what she was about to do sinking in. Once she plugged it in, there would be no turning back. She took a deep breath and inserted the drive. The screen flickered to life as files began to load. There were emails filled with coded language, audio recordings of conversations that made her skin crawl, and spreadsheets that seemed to detail quotas and targeting metrics. Each file painted a damning picture of a system designed to perpetuate inequality and protect those in power. But one file stood out. It was a recording labeled Internal Meeting. She clicked on it, her stomach churning as she listened. A voice she didn't recognize spoke first. We got to tighten things up. People are starting to ask questions. Another voice, deeper and more familiar, responded. Then we redirect. Blame it on bad apples. We can't let them dig too deep, or they'll find the roots. Her blood ran cold. The voice was Chief Reynolds. Natalie leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The man who had publicly promised accountability was implicated in the very corruption he claimed to condemn. This wasn't just about Garrett. It was bigger, more insidious than she'd imagined. She sat in the dark for a long time, the glow of the screen illuminating her determined expression. She had the evidence. Now, she had to decide what to do with it. But one thing was certain. This fight was far from over. Natalie sat in silence, the faint hum of her laptop the only sound in the room. The revelations from the files had left her breathless, her mind whirring with questions and strategies. Chief Reynolds wasn't just complicit, he was orchestrating it, steering the department's corruption from behind a veil of carefully crafted public statements. She leaned back, her hands gripping the edge of the desk, her resolve hardening with every passing second. She needed a plan, and she needed allies. Her first call was to Mark. It was late, but she knew he'd answer. He picked up on the second ring, his voice groggy but alert. "Natalie, what's wrong?" "I have proof," she said, her tone sharp and urgent. "It's worse than I thought." "What kind of proof?" he asked, his voice shifting into the calm, professional tone he used in court. "Emails, recordings, data. And Mark, it implicates Reynolds. He's not just covering for them. He's part of it." There was a long pause on the other end before Mark spoke again, his voice lower now. "This changes everything. We can't just go public with this, not yet. If Reynolds is as entrenched as you say, he'll have people watching every move you make." "I know," she replied. "That's why I need your help. I can't do this alone." Mark sighed, the weight of the situation sinking in. "All right, we'll meet in the morning and figure out our next step. But Natalie, be careful. If Reynolds finds out you have this, he won't just sit back and let you expose him." "I will," she said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. "See you tomorrow." The night was long and restless. Every creak in her apartment felt louder, every shadow darker. She double-checked her locks, her paranoia heightened by the knowledge of what she was up against. But when morning came, she was ready. Mark arrived at her apartment, his briefcase in hand and a determined expression on his face. He sat across from her at the kitchen table, spreading out papers and a laptop as she recounted everything she'd found. "We need to secure this data," he said, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he set up an encrypted backup. "If anything happens to you, or me, we can't risk losing it." Natalie nodded, watching him work. "And then what?" "We can't just sit on this." Mark looked up, his eyes serious. "We need to build a coalition. People who can protect you, support you, and help us bring this to light. Journalists, community leaders, even politicians. If we move carefully, we can control the narrative." She leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed. "And if Reynolds finds out?" Mark hesitated, his expression grim. "Then we make sure he can't bury it. But we need to act fast. The longer we wait, the more dangerous this gets." Their plan began to take shape over the next few days. Mark reached out to trusted journalists, carefully leaking bits of information to build public interest without revealing the full scope of their evidence. Natalie met with community leaders, sharing her story and rallying support for systemic reform. But as their movement grew, so did the risks. One evening, as Natalie returned to her apartment, she noticed something was off. The door was slightly ajar, the lock scratched and mangled. Her pulse quickened as she stepped inside, her eyes darting around the dimly lit space. Drawers had been pulled open, papers scattered across the floor. Someone had been there. She reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Mark. "Someone broke into my apartment," she said, her voice low and strained. "The files are still secure, but they were looking for something." "Get out of there," Mark said immediately. "Go somewhere safe. I'll handle the rest." She grabbed a small bag she had packed the night before, anticipating this very possibility. As she left her apartment, her heart pounding, she felt the weight of the fight pressing down on her. This wasn't just about exposing corruption anymore. It was about survival. Mark arranged for her to stay at a safe house, a small, nondescript apartment on the other side of town. The locks were reinforced, the windows shatterproof, and the building's security tight. But even there, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The breaking point came 2 days later. As Natalie prepared for a meeting with a prominent journalist, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. "You need to stop," a distorted voice said, cold and menacing. "This is bigger than you, Carter. Walk away before you get hurt." Her grip tightened on the phone, anger flaring in her chest. "Who is this?" The line went dead. She stood there for a moment, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Then, with a deep breath, she steeled herself. If they thought threats would scare her off, they didn't know who they were dealing with. At the meeting, Natalie laid everything out for the journalist, a seasoned reporter named Julia who had a reputation for uncovering corruption. Julia's eyes widened as she scrolled through the files, her lips tightening into a thin line. "This is explosive," Julia said, her voice hushed. "But it's also dangerous. If we publish this, Reynolds and his allies will come after all of us. That's why we need to be strategic," Natalie said. "We release enough to expose the corruption, but hold back the most damning evidence. That way, if they try to retaliate, we have leverage." Julia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "I'll start drafting the story. But Natalie, once this goes live, there's no going back." "I know," she said, her voice steady. "Do it." As the days passed, the tension grew. Natalie's every move felt scrutinized, every glance from a stranger tinged with suspicion. But she pressed on, her resolve unshaken. And when the story finally broke, it was like a bomb had gone off. The headline read, "Leaked Documents Reveal Corruption, Bias in Police Department." The article detailed the systemic misconduct, the targeted quotas, and the culture of silence enforced by fear. It stopped short of naming Reynolds, but the implications were clear. The public outcry was immediate and fierce. Protests swelled, demands for accountability growing louder with each passing day. But for Natalie, the fight was far from over. She knew Reynolds wouldn't go down without a fight, and she was ready for whatever came next. The real battle had just begun. As the protests roared outside the police precinct, Natalie sat in the safe house, her laptop open to an endless stream of emails and messages. Some were from supporters, thanking her for her bravery and sharing their own stories of injustice. Others were darker, filled with threats and vitriol, attempts to silence her resolve. Mark sat across from her, scrolling through his phone, his expression tense. "They're starting to panic," he said, breaking the heavy silence. "The city council just announced an emergency meeting. They're demanding answers from the department." Natalie glanced up, her eyes sharp. "And Reynolds? Has he made a statement?" Mark shook his head. "Not yet. He's laying low, probably waiting for the storm to pass." "He's not going to get that chance," she replied, her voice firm. "We have the evidence to force his hand. We just need the right moment." Before Mark could respond, her phone buzzed with a notification. She picked it up, her heart skipping a beat as she read the message. It was from Julia, the journalist who had published the initial story. "We need to meet. I've uncovered something big. Tonight." Usual spot. Natalie frowned, her mind racing. "Julia found something," she said aloud, showing the message to Mark. He frowned, concern flickering in his eyes. "It could be a trap, or it could be the break we need," she countered. I'm coming with you," Mark insisted, his tone leaving no room for argument. That evening, they arrived at the agreed location, a quiet park on the outskirts of the city. The air was cool, and the only sounds were the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of crickets. Natalie's nerves were on edge as they approached the bench where Julia sat, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone. "Julia," Natalie called out, her voice low but steady. The journalist looked up, her expression tense. She gestured for them to sit. "I don't have much time," she said, her voice hurried. "They're watching me. I can feel it." "What did you find?" Natalie asked, her gaze unwavering. Julia pulled out a folder, thick with documents, and handed it over. "It's bigger than we thought. This isn't just about the police department. It's the city council, the mayor's office. They're all in on it. Reynolds was just following orders." Natalie's stomach turned as she flipped through the papers. There were contracts, emails, even handwritten notes linking key figures in the city to the systemic corruption. It wasn't just about quotas and profiling. It was about money, power, and control. Mark leaned over, his brow furrowed. "If this gets out, it could bring down the entire administration." "That's why we need to be careful," Julia said, her voice urgent. "They won't let this go without a fight. And Natalie, you're already their target." Before she could respond, a car engine roared to life nearby, its headlights cutting through the darkness. Julia's head snapped toward the sound, her eyes wide with fear. "They found me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Run," Natalie said, grabbing the folder and pulling Julia to her feet. Mark followed, his phone already in hand, dialing the safe house's emergency number. The three of them sprinted through the park, the sound of footsteps and shouted orders growing louder behind them. Natalie's heart pounded as adrenaline surged through her veins. She clutched the folder tightly, knowing it was the key to everything. They reached the edge of the park, where a car Mark had arranged was waiting. The driver, a young man with sharp eyes, waved them in hurriedly. "Get in," he shouted. As the car sped away, Natalie glanced back, her breath catching at the sight of figures emerging from the shadows, their faces obscured but their intent clear. They were after the folder and anyone who held it. The car ride was tense, the air thick with unspoken fears. Julia sat hunched over, her hands trembling as she tried to catch her breath. Mark was on the phone, coordinating their next moves, while Natalie stared out the window, her mind racing. "We can't go to the safe house," Mark said finally, his voice tight. "It's too risky now. We need a new plan." Natalie turned to him, her resolve hardening. "Then we go public. All of it. Tonight." Mark hesitated, his concern evident. "Natalie, if we do that, there's no going back. They'll come after you harder than ever." "They already are," she replied, her voice unwavering. "If we don't release this, they'll bury it, and us along with it." Julia looked up, her eyes red but determined. "She's right. This is too big to keep under wraps. We need to hit them where it hurts." They drove to a secure location, a small office Mark had rented under an alias, equipped with the technology they needed. Natalie and Julia worked tirelessly, scanning and uploading the documents while Mark reached out to trusted allies to prepare for the fallout. As the clock ticked toward midnight, the story went live. It wasn't just an article. It was a full exposé, complete with names, dates, and the undeniable proof of corruption that stretched to the highest levels of city government. Social media erupted almost instantly, the hashtag exposed the system trending within minutes. But as the world reacted, Natalie knew their battle was far from over. She could almost feel the ripple of panic spreading through the city's power players, their desperation growing with every passing second. The question wasn't whether they would retaliate. It was how. As the first light of dawn broke through the windows, Natalie sat back, exhaustion etched into her face, but her determination burning brighter than ever. This was the fight of her life, and she wasn't backing down. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, illuminating the city below, the chaos ignited by Natalie's exposé rippled through every corner of the administration. News outlets picked up the story almost instantly, dissecting the documents and uncovering even more connections between city officials and the systemic corruption Natalie had revealed. But with the light of day came the inevitable shadows, and Natalie knew the next move wouldn't come from her. It would come from them. Her phone buzzed incessantly, messages flooding in from supporters, journalists, and even strangers who had read the story. Amid the encouragement were the veiled threats and cryptic warnings, each one reminding her just how dangerous her position had become. Mark sat across from her, his eyes glued to a tablet displaying the latest headlines, his jaw tight as he scanned the flurry of breaking news. "They're scrambling," he said finally, his tone grim. "City council's calling an emergency press conference at noon. They'll try to spin this." Natalie nodded, her mind racing. "They'll deflect, blame Reynolds, call him a rogue element. They'll distance themselves from the evidence and hope the public buys it." "Then we don't let them," Mark replied. "We need a counter-strategy, something that keeps the pressure on." Before Natalie could respond, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a number she didn't recognize. She hesitated, then answered, her voice cautious. "Miss Carter," a deep, measured voice spoke on the other end. "This is Councilman Harris. I believe we need to talk." Natalie's brow furrowed, her instincts immediately on high alert. "What do you want?" "I want to help," Harris said, his tone careful but insistent. "But not over the phone. Meet me in person, somewhere secure. I think you'll find what I have to say illuminating." She exchanged a glance with Mark, who mouthed, "Who is it?" Natalie gestured for him to wait, her mind torn between suspicion and curiosity. "Where?" she asked finally, her voice steady but firm. Harris gave her an address, a small cafe on the outskirts of the city, and a time. "Come alone," he added before hanging up. Mark immediately shook his head. "No way. It's too dangerous." "I won't be alone," Natalie countered. "You'll be nearby, watching everything." Mark's expression softened slightly, though his concern lingered. "If this is a trap, then we'll find out," she interrupted. "But if Harris is telling the truth, he could be the key to taking this all the way." The hours leading up to the meeting crawled by, every tick of the clock stretching the tension tighter. When the time came, Natalie and Mark arrived at the cafe separately. She stepped inside, scanning the small, quiet space. Harris was already there, seated at a corner table, his posture relaxed but his eyes watchful. He was an older man, his neatly trimmed beard flecked with gray, and his tailored suit suggesting someone accustomed to wielding authority. "Natalie Carter," he greeted as she approached. "I admire your courage." She didn't sit immediately, her gaze sharp. "Flattery won't get you far." "Why am I here?" Harris gestured to the seat across from him. "Because you need allies, and I need a way out." She hesitated, then sat, her movements deliberate. "Go on." Harris leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. "You've exposed the corruption, but what you've found is only the surface. The deeper you dig, the more dangerous it becomes. The people behind this, they don't just play dirty. They destroy anyone who threatens them." "And you?" Natalie asked, her tone laced with suspicion. "Are you one of them?" "I was," he admitted without hesitation. "But not by choice. You don't rise to my position without making compromises. At first, I told myself it was just politics. But this is something else." Natalie's eyes narrowed. "Why should I believe you?" Harris reached into his briefcase, pulling out a thin folder and sliding it across the table. "Because I have nothing to gain by lying to you. Inside are records, transactions, communications, directives. It's enough to prove that Reynolds isn't the mastermind. He's a puppet." She opened the folder, her eyes scanning the documents. The evidence was damning. Bank transfers linked to offshore accounts, signed memos implicating high-ranking officials, and a chain of emails detailing orders to suppress investigations into police misconduct. "If this is real," she said, her voice steady, "you're as guilty as the rest of them." Harris nodded, his expression grim. "I won't deny it, but I'm offering you a way to take them all down. In return, I want immunity." Natalie stared at him, the weight of his offer pressing down on her. She knew Mark would object, that granting immunity to someone like Harris would be controversial at best. But if his information was as valuable as it seemed, it could be the breakthrough they needed. "I'll think about it," she said finally, standing to leave. "But if you're lying—" "I'm not," Harris interrupted, his voice firm. "You don't have time to hesitate, Miss Carter. The people you're up against are already moving. If you don't act now, they will." As she walked out of the cafe, folder in hand, Mark emerged from his vantage point, his expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "What did he want?" "To make a deal," Natalie replied, handing him the folder. "He says Reynolds is just the beginning." Mark flipped through the documents, his eyes widening. "If this is legit, it's explosive." "It's also dangerous," Natalie said. "We need to verify it before we do anything else. And we need to prepare for whatever comes next." Mark nodded, his determination mirroring hers. "Let's get to work." The revelations from Harris's folder added a new layer of complexity to their fight. Every name, every connection, every detail had to be vetted, and every move calculated. But as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place, it became clear that the stakes were higher than they had ever imagined. For Natalie, there was no turning back. The fight wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was about survival, justice, and the kind of change that could reshape the entire system. And as the storm around her grew, so did her resolve. She was ready to face whatever came next. Natalie and Mark spent the next several hours meticulously combing through the folder Harris had provided. Every document seemed to lead to another thread, another name, another scandal. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became that this wasn't just corruption. It was a well-oiled machine designed to protect those in power at the expense of everyone else. And now that machine was starting to crack under the pressure of Natalie's revelations. Mark leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair as he stared at the pile of evidence on the table. This isn't just a citywide issue. These connections go to state officials, private corporations, even federal contracts. If we release this, it could spark an investigation that takes down half the state's leadership. Natalie crossed her arms, her gaze fixed on the map of connections they had pinned to the wall. That's exactly why they'll do everything they can to stop us. This isn't just about protecting their secrets, it's about survival. Mark nodded, his expression grim. Then we need to be smart about this. If we release everything at once, they'll bury it, or worse, bury us. Natalie turned to him, her resolve unwavering. We need to expose enough to force their hand, but not so much that we lose leverage. Harris said Reynolds is just a puppet. If we can tie him to the bigger players, it'll be harder for them to deny their involvement. Before Mark could respond, Natalie's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, her stomach tightening when she saw another unknown number. She hesitated, then answered, her voice sharp. "This is Natalie." A low, measured voice came through the line. "Ms. Carter, this is Detective Rollins. I'm with Internal Affairs. I think we need to talk." Her grip on the phone tightened, suspicion flaring. "Why?" "Because I've been watching this department for a long time," Rollins said. "And what you've uncovered matches up with things I've been trying to prove for years. But I'm not calling to congratulate you. I'm calling to warn you. You've made enemies, and they're closer than you think." Natalie exchanged a glance with Mark, who immediately began writing down notes. "Go on." Rollins sighed, the sound heavy with exhaustion. "Reynolds isn't going to take this lying down. He's already mobilizing his people, officers loyal to him, and a few on the payroll of others higher up. You've made yourself a target, and they're not above making you disappear if it means protecting themselves." Her chest tightened, but she kept her voice steady. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I've spent too long watching them get away with it," Rollins replied. "And I can't take them down alone. You have the spotlight, the evidence, and the momentum. But if you're not careful, they'll turn it all against you." Natalie's mind raced. "What do you suggest?" "Meet me," Rollins said. "I have information that can help you. But I need to know I can trust you." "Trust works both ways, Detective," she said, her tone firm. "How do I know you're not working for them?" There was a pause on the other end before Rollins replied, his voice softer now. "Because if I were, you wouldn't be having this conversation." Natalie hesitated, then agreed to meet him later that evening. As she hung up, Mark's expression darkened. "Another meeting with a stranger who claims to have answers? This is starting to feel like a pattern." "I know," Natalie admitted. "But if Rollins is legit, he could be the ally we need inside the system. And if he's not, then we find out the hard way." Mark finished, his frustration clear. "Just promise me you'll be careful." Hours later, Natalie and Mark arrived at the agreed location, a secluded parking garage downtown. The dim lighting and echoing silence set her nerves on edge as they stepped out of the car. Rollins was waiting, leaning against a concrete pillar with his hands in his pockets. He was tall and wiry, his face lined with years of wear, but his eyes were sharp, scanning the surroundings as if expecting an ambush. "You're Natalie Carter," he said as she approached, his voice low but steady. "And you must be Mark Edwards. I've read your briefs. Impressive work." Mark didn't reply, his gaze wary. Natalie cut to the chase. "You said you have information. Let's hear it." Rollins nodded, pulling a small envelope from his jacket and handing it to her. "Inside are personnel files on Reynolds' inner circle, officers and officials who've been keeping his operation running. Some of them are dirty, others are just scared. But there's one name you'll want to pay special attention to." Natalie opened the envelope, her eyes scanning the documents until one name jumped out at her. Her breath caught. "Councilman Harris." Rollins nodded grimly. "He's not just a player in this. He's one of the architects. Whatever deal he tried to make with you, it's to save his own skin." Natalie's stomach churned. She thought of the folder Harris had given her, the carefully curated evidence that painted him as a reluctant participant rather than a mastermind. Why would he risk coming to me if he's so deeply involved? Because he knows the walls are closing in, Rollins said. He's trying to shift the blame, make you think he's an ally. But trust me, Harris will burn you the moment it benefits him. Natalie's grip on the envelope tightened. Then why give me this now? Because I need you to understand what you're up against, Rollins said, his voice sharp. Harris is dangerous, but he's not the top of the chain. If you take him down, you'll draw out the real players. That's when the fight gets ugly. Mark stepped forward, his skepticism evident. And what's your role in all this? Why haven't you taken them down yourself? Rollins smirked, though there was no humor in it. Because the system is rigged to protect people like them. Every time I've gotten close, the evidence disappears. Witnesses recant, and I'm left holding the bag. But you've already cracked the foundation. If we work together, we can bring the whole thing down. Natalie studied him, her mind churning with possibilities. Rollins's information could be the key to dismantling the network of corruption, but it also meant navigating an even more dangerous path. She turned to Mark, who gave a reluctant nod. All right, she said, turning back to Rollins. We'll work together. But if I find out you're playing me, you won't, Rollins interrupted, his expression serious. Because I need this to end as much as you do. As they parted ways, Natalie couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were indeed closing in. With each new revelation, the stakes climbed higher, the danger more palpable. But for every threat, every shadowed figure watching her from the corner of her eye, her resolve only grew stronger. This wasn't just a fight for justice. It was a fight for survival, and she was ready to see it through to the bitter end. The night stretched long after the meeting with Detective Rollins. Natalie sat in the dim glow of her safe house's desk lamp, flipping through the files he had given her. Each page revealed more pieces of the puzzle. Names, connections, decisions that showed how the corruption wasn't just systematic but deliberate, carefully built over years by people who knew how to manipulate power. Mark paced the small room, his frustration palpable. So Harris is deeper in this than we thought. What's our play here? Expose him now, or hold back and let him dig himself a deeper hole? Natalie leaned back, her mind racing. If we expose him too soon, he'll claim we're retaliating against his deal. He'll play the victim and use it to discredit us. Mark stopped pacing and turned to her, his brow furrowed. But if we wait, we risk losing control of the narrative. Someone like Harris doesn't stay quiet for long. She tapped the folder with her fingers, her expression hardening. Then we set a trap. We let him think he's safe, that we're buying his story. And when the time is right, we use his own lies against him. Mark nodded slowly, his frustration giving way to reluctant agreement. All right, but we'll need more than this to make it stick. If he's as entrenched as Rollins says, he'll have people protecting him. Before Natalie could respond, her phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with a message, another unknown number. She hesitated, then opened it. The text was brief, but chilling. Stop digging, or you'll regret it. Mark leaned over her shoulder, his expression darkening. They're trying to scare you. It won't work, she said, her voice cold. But it means we're getting close. They wouldn't be this desperate if we weren't a threat. The next day, Natalie and Mark worked tirelessly to consolidate their findings. They reached out to journalists and whistleblowers, slowly building a coalition of voices willing to speak out. Meanwhile, Rollins provided more intel, carefully navigating his position within the department to avoid suspicion. But the pressure was mounting. Every move felt like a calculated risk, and the shadows seemed to grow longer with each passing hour. As they prepared their next steps, Natalie received another call, this time from Julia, the journalist who had published the initial expose. Her voice was tense, urgent. Natalie, we need to meet. I've uncovered something you need to see. Is it safe? Natalie asked, her instincts on high alert. I think so, but we can't wait. This could change everything. Natalie agreed, setting a time and place. When she told Mark, his concern was immediate. This is starting to feel like a pattern, he said, his voice low. Every time we get close to something big, someone calls with a new revelation. What if they're baiting you? I trust Julia, Natalie replied, though the doubt in her voice was undeniable. But I won't go in blind. You'll follow me, and we'll have Rollins on standby. That evening, Natalie arrived at the meeting spot, a small newsroom on the edge of downtown. The office was dimly lit, the hum of computers and the rustle of papers filling the air. Julia was waiting for her, a folder clutched tightly in her hands. "You're not going to believe this," Julia said, her voice trembling slightly as she handed over the folder. Inside were photos, bank statements, and emails, evidence linking Harris not just to corruption, but to violent intimidation tactics used to silence dissent. One photo in particular made Natalie's blood run cold. It was a grainy surveillance shot of her leaving the cafe after meeting Harris, a shadowy figure following close behind. "They've been watching you," Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Harris is panicking. He knows you're onto him, and he's trying to figure out your next move." Natalie's jaw tightened as she flipped through the documents. "This isn't just about protecting himself. He's trying to set us up, make it look like we're the ones crossing the line." Julia nodded. "And if we don't act fast, he might succeed. I can publish this, but we need a plan to keep the focus on him and not let him spin it." Before Natalie could respond, the door to the newsroom creaked open. Mark stepped inside, his face pale and drawn. "We have a problem," he said, his voice sharp. "Rollins just called. Harris knows about the file, and he's called for an emergency press conference. He's going to paint himself as the victim." Julia cursed under her breath, her frustration evident. "Of course he is. That's exactly what I warned you about." Natalie closed the folder, her mind racing. "Then we get ahead of him. Julia, you publish everything now. Mark, we prepare a statement. If Harris wants to play the victim, we'll make sure the evidence speaks louder than his lies." The next few hours were a blur of activity. Julia worked with her team to verify and publish the new revelations, while Mark and Natalie crafted a response designed to counter Harris's inevitable spin. As the press conference began, Natalie watched from the safe house, her stomach churning as Harris took the podium. He was calm, composed, his voice measured as he spoke. "In recent weeks, I have been the target of baseless accusations, part of a smear campaign designed to undermine my commitment to this city. I want to be clear, I have nothing to hide. These allegations are a distraction from the real issues we should be addressing." But as he continued, the first headlines from Julia's story began to break. Reporters in the audience glanced at their phones, their expressions shifting as the weight of the new evidence sank in. One by one, they began to raise their hands, their questions cutting through Harris's rehearsed statements. "Councilman Harris, how do you explain the bank transfers detailed in today's report? What about the photos linking you to known enforcers of political intimidation?" Harris's composure began to crack, his answers becoming more defensive. But the final blow came when Julia herself, standing at the back of the room, asked her question. "Councilman, were you aware that Natalie Carter had obtained evidence of your involvement in these activities? And if so, did you order surveillance on her to intimidate her into silence?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Harris. His jaw clenched, his hands gripping the edges of the podium. For a moment, he seemed poised to deny it. But then, with the cameras rolling and the evidence mounting, he turned and walked away, leaving the press conference in chaos. Back at the safe house, Natalie let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling slightly as she turned off the live stream. Mark placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "That was just the beginning," he said. "Now we go after the rest of them." Natalie nodded, her determination solidifying. She knew the fight was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like they were winning. And she wasn't about to stop now. As Harris disappeared from the podium, leaving behind a swarm of shouting reporters, Natalie leaned back in her chair, the tension in her shoulders slowly releasing. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to savor the sight of him cornered, his lies unraveling in real time. But the satisfaction was fleeting. She knew Harris was just the tip of the iceberg, and the people behind him wouldn't let his fall go unanswered. Mark sat beside her, scrolling through the immediate reactions online. Social media is blowing up. Harris's walkout is all over the news, and Julia's article is trending. People are demanding a full investigation into the council. Natalie nodded, but her focus was already shifting to the next step. This isn't enough to bring them all down. We need more. Harris might have been a puppet, but the ones pulling the strings are still in play. Mark hesitated, his gaze sharpening. What about Rollins? If anyone knows where to find the rest of the evidence, it's him. Natalie considered it, her mind racing through the possibilities. Rollins had proven himself useful so far, but she still wasn't sure how deep his loyalties ran. If he had been in the department for as long as he claimed, he might be more entangled in the system than he let on. Before she could respond, her phone buzzed with a call. It was Rollins. She answered, her voice cautious. "Detective, I saw the press conference," Rollins said, his tone tight. "You rattled the hornet's nest. Harris was their shield, and now that he's gone, they're going to come after you directly. What do you have for me?" Natalie asked, skipping past the warning. There was a pause before Rollins spoke again, his voice lower. "I've been digging into Reynolds' connections, and I found something you'll want to see. Meet me at the old industrial park on 8th Street. Bring backup, but keep it quiet." Mark frowned as Natalie relayed the information. "This feels wrong. Why would he want to meet in a place like that? It's too exposed." Natalie's jaw tightened. "Because he's scared. If he's right about the nest being rattled, they'll be watching him too. We don't have a choice." Mark sighed, his reluctance evident. "All right, but I'm not letting you go in there alone. I'll stay close." As they drove to the industrial park, the city lights gave way to the sprawling, desolate expanse of abandoned warehouses and rusted machinery. The air was heavy with the faint smell of oil and metal, and the sound of their footsteps echoed eerily as they approached the meeting point. Rollins was waiting near the edge of a dimly lit loading dock, his posture tense. He looked over his shoulder constantly, his unease palpable. When he saw Natalie and Mark, he motioned them closer, his voice a harsh whisper. "We don't have much time. I found records, old case files that were buried by Reynolds and his people. They detail how the department coordinated with certain council members to silence whistleblowers and intimidate activists. It's enough to prove a conspiracy, but it's incomplete." "Where are the files?" Natalie asked, her tone sharp. Rollins reached into his jacket and handed her a USB drive. "This is everything I could copy without raising suspicion. But there's more physical evidence locked away in a department storage facility. It's been flagged as restricted access, which means it's sensitive. If we can get it, you'll have the smoking gun you need." Mark glanced around the area, his wariness growing. "And what's stopping them from destroying it now?" "They don't know we're onto it yet," Rollins replied. "But once they realize Harris is out of play, they'll cover their tracks. You'll need to move fast." Before Natalie could respond, the sound of tires screeching broke through the quiet. Headlights cut through the darkness, and 3 black SUVs skidded to a stop nearby. Doors flew open, and armed men spilled out, their faces obscured by masks. "Get down!" Rollins shouted, pulling his gun. Natalie and Mark dove behind a stack of crates as gunfire erupted, the sharp cracks reverberating through the air. Rollins returned fire, his movements precise and practiced, but he was outnumbered. Natalie's heart pounded as she fumbled for her phone, trying to call for help, but the screen showed no signal. Mark crouched beside her, his face pale but focused. "We have to get out of here." "Not without the drive," she said, clutching the USB tightly. Rollins yelled from his position, his voice strained. "Go! I'll hold them off." Natalie hesitated, torn between leaving and helping him, but Mark grabbed her arm. "We can't help him if we're dead. Move!" They sprinted toward the far end of the dock, weaving between rusted equipment and stacks of debris as the gunfire intensified. The masked men seemed more intent on stopping them than Rollins, their bullets sparking off the metal around them. As they rounded a corner, Natalie spotted an old utility truck parked near the fence. "There!" she shouted. Mark broke into a run, reaching the truck first and yanking the door open. The keys were still in the ignition, and he started the engine as Natalie climbed in. The truck roared to life, and they sped away, the masked men shouting and firing after them. When they were finally out of range, Natalie looked back, her chest heaving. "Do you think Rollins made it?" Mark's grip on the wheel tightened. "I don't know, but he bought us time. We need to make it count." They drove in silence, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on them. When they finally reached a secure location, Natalie plugged the USB into her laptop, her hands trembling slightly. The files were there, detailed reports, internal memos, even surveillance footage. But as she scrolled through them, her stomach dropped. "There's a name missing," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mark leaned over, frowning. "What do you mean?" Natalie pointed to the list of key players Rollins had mentioned. "Reynolds isn't on here. It's like they erased him completely." Mark's expression darkened. Or he erased himself. Natalie's eyes narrowed, her determination reigniting. "Then we find him. If he's trying this hard to disappear, it means he's the key to everything." Mark nodded, his resolve matching hers. "Let's finish this." They knew the road ahead would only get more dangerous, but they also knew they couldn't stop now. The pieces were falling into place, and the truth was within reach. All they had to do was survive long enough to expose it. As the night wore on, Natalie and Mark pored over the files on the USB drive, their exhaustion mounting with every new piece of damning evidence they uncovered. The documents painted a grim picture. Case files buried, witnesses silenced, and payouts to ensure compliance. But the glaring absence of Reynolds' name gnawed at Natalie. It was too deliberate, too clean, as if someone had meticulously scrubbed any trace of him from the records. Mark leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. If Reynolds is the key, he's buried himself deep. This doesn't happen by accident. Someone like him doesn't just disappear without help. Natalie's eyes remained fixed on the screen, her mind racing. Then we find out who helped him. No one covers their tracks this thoroughly without leaving breadcrumbs. Mark hesitated, his gaze shifting to the window, where the faint glow of city lights cast long shadows. And what if Rollins was wrong? What if Reynolds isn't just a puppet, but something worse? Natalie's stomach tightened at the thought. Then we expose him for exactly what he is. No matter how high this goes, we're not stopping. Her phone buzzed, the screen lighting up with a familiar number. It was Julia. Natalie answered, her voice tense. "Julia, what is it?" "You're not going to believe this," Julia said, her voice a mix of urgency and disbelief. "I've been following up on the files you sent me, and I found something strange. Reynolds has been linked to a series of offshore accounts under aliases. The amounts being moved are astronomical, millions, maybe more. But here's the kicker. Some of the transactions are recent, as in hours ago." Natalie's pulse quickened. "He's still active. Where's the money going?" "I don't know yet," Julia admitted. "But if he's moving that kind of money now, it means he's either running or planning something big." Mark leaned closer, his expression darkening as he listened. "If Reynolds is trying to disappear, he won't do it quietly. He's cleaning up his mess. Or escalating," Natalie added, her voice tight. "Julia, keep digging. Let us know the moment you find anything else." As Natalie ended the call, a sinking realization settled over her. Reynolds wasn't just trying to save himself. He was taking steps to ensure no one could touch him. And if he was moving money, it meant he still had resources, allies, and a plan. Mark stood, his jaw tight. "We need to force his hand. If we wait, he'll slip through the cracks." "How?" Natalie asked, her frustration evident. "We can't release what we have until we know where he's hiding. If we do, he'll just vanish." Mark's gaze sharpened. "Then we draw him out. Make him think he's safe, that we don't know how close we are. If he thinks he has the upper hand, he'll make a mistake." Natalie nodded slowly, her mind already piecing together the strategy. "And when he does, we'll be ready." Over the next day, they worked tirelessly to craft a narrative, leaking just enough information to suggest they were shifting focus away from Reynolds, while behind the scenes, they coordinated with Julia and a handful of trusted allies to track his movements. Every breadcrumb, every minor transaction, every fleeting mention of his aliases became a thread to follow. It wasn't long before their efforts paid off. Julia called again, her voice tinged with urgency. "Natalie, we've got him. One of the offshore accounts just made a payment to a private airfield outside the city. It's registered under an alias we traced back to Reynolds." Natalie's heart raced. "He's trying to flee." "Looks like it," Julia replied. "But there's more. The payment wasn't just for a flight. It was for a team of private security. Armed." Mark's expression darkened as Natalie relayed the information. "He's not just running. He's preparing for a fight. Natalie's resolve hardened. Then we bring the fight to him. With Rollins' help, they coordinated a plan. Rollins would secure a warrant to intercept Reynolds at the airfield, while Natalie and Mark worked with Julia to ensure the story broke in real time, making it impossible for Reynolds' allies to intervene without exposing themselves. But as the hours ticked down, the tension grew palpable. When they arrived at the airfield, the scene was eerily quiet. Rows of hangars stretched into the darkness, their shadows long and foreboding. Rollins was already there, his team waiting in unmarked vehicles at the perimeter. He approached Natalie and Mark, his expression grim. "He's here," Rollins said. "We spotted his security team an hour ago. They're guarding one of the hangars. We're waiting on final confirmation before moving in." Natalie nodded, her nerves tightly wound. "And if he's armed? Then we handle it," Rollins replied, his tone firm. "But you need to stay back. If this goes south, we can't risk losing you." Before Natalie could argue, a sudden commotion drew their attention. From the direction of the hangar, the low hum of engines rumbled, followed by the sharp glare of headlights cutting through the darkness. A convoy of black SUVs emerged, heading toward the runway. "He's making his move," Rollins muttered, signaling to his team. "Go, now!" Chaos erupted as Rollins' team moved in, their vehicles blocking the convoy's path. Security guards spilled out of the SUVs, their weapons drawn, but they were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer precision of Rollins' operation. Natalie and Mark watched from a safe distance, their breaths held as the scene unfolded. As the dust settled, Rollins approached one of the SUVs, his gun drawn. The door opened slowly, and Reynolds stepped out, his hands raised, but his expression calm, almost smug. "You've made a mistake," Reynolds said, his voice steady. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with?" Rollins smirked, his grip on his weapon unwavering. "Oh, I think we do." Natalie stepped forward, her heart pounding as she locked eyes with Reynolds. For a moment, the two of them stood in silence, the weight of everything between them pressing down. Then, with a steady voice, she said, "It's over, Reynolds. You can't run from this." Reynolds' smirk faltered, but only slightly. "You think this ends with me? You have no idea how deep this goes." "Then we'll find out," Natalie replied, her voice firm. "One piece at a time." As Rollins' team cuffed Reynolds and led him away, Natalie felt a strange mix of relief and apprehension. This was a victory, but it wasn't the end. Reynolds was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, and the fight was far from over. But as she stood there, watching the man who had orchestrated so much harm finally face accountability, she knew one thing for certain. She wasn't done yet. As the convoy of vehicles disappeared into the night, taking Reynolds into custody, Natalie stood at the edge of the airfield, the chill of the evening air biting against her skin. She should have felt triumphant, but instead, a heavy unease settled in her chest. Mark stood beside her, silent, his face tense as he watched the tail lights fade into the distance. "That was too easy," Natalie murmured, her voice barely audible. Mark turned to her, his brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "We got him. He's going to face justice." She shook her head, her instincts prickling with doubt. Reynolds isn't the type to go down without a fight. He's always 3 steps ahead. This surrender? It doesn't feel right. Before Mark could respond, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She glanced at the screen, a message from Julia. It was just 2 words, "Check now." Natalie's pulse quickened as she opened the attachment. It was a live feed from an encrypted server. Her eyes widened as she watched the video, a heavily secured data center with rows of servers, its location unidentified. On the screen, masked individuals moved swiftly, carrying equipment and loading drives into bags. The timestamp showed it was happening in real time. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "This isn't over. He's covering his tracks. Right now." Mark leaned over her shoulder, his expression darkening as he watched the video. "They're destroying the evidence." Natalie's mind raced. Reynolds isn't the endgame. He's just the bait. They're cleaning house while we're distracted. Suddenly, another figure appeared on the screen, one she recognized instantly. Councilman Harris. He wasn't panicked or rushed. He was directing the operation, issuing orders with chilling calm. Mark's jaw clenched. He's still in play, and he's not working alone. The video cut off abruptly, leaving only the faint glow of Natalie's phone in the darkness. She turned to Mark, her determination hardening. We were wrong to think Reynolds was the mastermind. Harris and whoever he's working with. This was their plan all along. A cold wind swept across the airfield as the weight of realization settled over them. Every step they'd taken, every victory they thought they'd achieved, had been carefully calculated by an enemy who was always one move ahead. Natalie took a deep breath, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. This isn't the end, Mark. It's a beginning. Mark met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and resolve. Then we keep going, no matter how far it takes us. As they walked toward their car, Natalie glanced back one last time at the empty runway. Somewhere out there, the real fight was waiting, and she knew it would be more dangerous than anything they had faced so far. But she also knew she couldn't stop now, not when so many lives depended on the truth coming to light. The screen fades to black, and the words appear. It's just the beginning. To everyone watching, what do you think will happen next? Share your thoughts in the comments. Your insights and ideas inspire us to keep the story going. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family to keep the conversation alive, and hit that subscribe button to join us for the next chapter of this thrilling journey. There's so much more to uncover, and you won't want to miss a second. See you in the next video.